The blare of the alarms was drowned out by the thunderous avalanche of rubble, concrete, and rebar cascading down from the sheer force of each impact. Every strike hit like an earthquake, shaking the entire site. It was felt by every member of personnel on every level, even those deep underground, working in subterranean containment chambers and testing environments. Researcher Moto had covered their face with their arms, shielding themselves in vain as they watched the ceiling come crumbling down on top of them. It was only after the noise died down that they realized they were in the dark, eyes screwed shut, but unmistakably, and much to their relief, still alive. Laying prone, they tried to shift themselves, now squeezed between the weight of the rubble that was piled on top of them. As Moto squirmed, they felt their foot nudge against something soft and heavy, though seemingly not as immovable as the pile overhead. Moto tapped at it again. The mass was just within reach, but only yielded slightly when they exerted pressure on it. Pushing harder, the researcher tried to shift whatever it was, hoping that if they could move it, then beyond would be a route to safety. It was only when Moto kicked hard enough to feel the crack of bone underfoot that they realized what and who it was. Researcher Kayaku had been right behind them when the ceiling came down. Moto's stomach churned. They felt nauseous to know their friend and lab partner wasn't just dead, but that their body was now blocking their way out from under the rubble. The researcher panicked, screaming for help, hoping that some member of site security would overhear and hurry to move the pile of concrete on top of them. Yet nobody came. The more Researcher Moto lost their composure, the more air they were using up, air that was limited. Suddenly, from beyond the pile came another rumble of impact. The anomalies were still fighting. The force of the impact must have shifted the debris enough to allow in a sliver of light. Turning to look towards it, the trapped researcher could see the body by their feet, Kayaku's eyes still open but lifeless. The light was coming from somewhere beyond them. Moto needed to either move the corpse or somehow get past it. Trying desperately to control their breathing, Moto channeled their remaining strength into shifting Kayaku's body, pushing against it with one leg, then both at the same time. Each time they heard a joint snap, bent out of place and dislocated by the jagged trap of the rubble, Moto forced the rising lump in the back of their throat back down. They could feel that Kayaku was starting to budge, just slightly. Then a large wedge of rubble caught them, just as more light started to flood into the crevice. A path had opened up, but barely. Moto started to shimmy backwards, feeling their way with their feet. They passed Kayaku's body, their haunting, unblinking eyes staring right through them. The researcher tried to pull their colleague out from under the rubble, desperately hoping to move the body with one hand, while also pushing themselves back and out of the opening. It looked to be working, and it took every ounce of strength and breath that Moto had left in them. They twisted and contorted themselves as best as they could, until their feet kicked away some of the looser chunks of concrete, creating an opening just wide enough to slip through. Desperately, they pulled at Kayaku's lab coat, only to hear it tear suddenly. Frantic, they scrabbled at the material, pulling harder, only for it to come away in their hand. Before they could grab Researcher Kayaku's cold hand, another rumble of impact struck, this time much closer. Moto could feel the shifting debris and hurriedly crawled backwards, watching Kayaku's body being buried. Pulling themselves free, Researcher Moto looked towards the source of the impact and froze instantly. They saw the two battling anomalies now, and it had effectively hit a pause on their fight. A pause that would only last until the second that Moto looked away or blinked. SCP-343 and SCP-173, both trapped mid-combat. Tendrils of the sculpture's rebar limbs were wound tightly around the old man's neck, suspending him in midair. Normally, he'd have little trouble swatting a foe away with the flick of his hand, or willing them out of existence without breaking a sweat, but the anomaly many believed to be a god looked to be worse for wear. He'd suffered several hits already from SCP-173, and looked poised to deliver a strike back, though his almighty fists wouldn't fly while Researcher Moto was watching. Dust from the concrete clung to Moto's skin as beads of sweat rolled down their neck and under their shirt collar. Every fiber of their exhausted and shattered being, every bruised and aching muscle, were all diverting what little strength researcher Moto had towards keeping both eyes open, locked on the scene in front of them. They couldn't keep watch forever, but with the sight around them decimated, they had to keep the fighting paused for as long as possible, just until the rescue team showed up. Researcher Moto stifled a twitch in their eyelid, feeling the surface of their eyeball sting, drying out thanks to the dust in the air. Just a while longer, they urged themselves. This staring contest plan could not have gone more wrong. Several days prior, researcher Moto had been rushing down the halls of minimal security Site-17, back when the corridors were still intact. They'd made an alarming discovery and needed to tell someone, but doing so would put them both in grave danger. There was only one person Moto could think to consult, the single friendly face that had proven themselves as trustworthy and reliable as they were pragmatic, fellow researcher Kaiku. Racing past other personnel in Foundation-issue lab coats, Moto spotted their friend, hurrying over to walk alongside them. They urged Kaiku not to draw attention. There was something the pair of them needed to talk about, and it had to be somewhere that they were certain nobody else could see or hear them. Kaiku didn't ask questions. It was clear that whatever was going on, their friend was distressed. This was serious. After looking for about an hour, the two discovered an empty room and hurried inside, even sliding a nearby broom through the door handles. Kaiku's concern only grew when Moto worried that it wouldn't be enough. At their lab partner's insistence, researcher Moto calmed themselves down enough to confide in Kaiku about what had them so paranoid. It was SCP-343. Most knew the stories. SCP-343 was first discovered by the Foundation teleporting between rooftops in Prague. Ever since he'd been detained at Site-17, and while he was considered to be safe, the reality-warping old man had displayed he could exit the Foundation facility at will. Everyone always joked about the infamous incident that took place during SCP-343's initial interview. He had been asked to prove his lofty claims about being the creator of the universe, and in response, he walked through a wall, only to return seconds later eating a hamburger. Anytime Kaiku asked a question they didn't have a solid answer for, Moto would walk into a wall in jest and claim they were off to Wendy's. But what Moto had discovered about SCP-343 wasn't a cause for jokes. Given that confining SCP-343 to one place seemed to be a physical impossibility, the general belief had been that he'd submitted to containment willingly and agreed to only leave his containment chamber when the Foundation deemed it appropriate. But the former site director of Site-17, Dr. Beck, had grown suspicious of SCP-343, and researcher Moto, completely by accident, had become fixated on Beck because it seemed that he had never existed. While trawling through the Foundation's own archives, Moto had come across several corrupted and fragmented files relating to SCP-343 that had taken months to digitally piece back together. From what they could determine, Dr. Beck had definitely been a member of the SCP Foundation, but there was no record or mention of him anywhere within the Foundation's records. By reconstructing what had happened from the loose details they could find, Moto had determined a rough timeline of what had happened. Dr. Beck had been assigned to SCP-343 shortly after the entity was discovered, and after growing suspicious of the old man, began to question his claims about supposedly being God. Using his authority as site director, Beck issued orders to personnel that all conversations with SCP-343 needed to first be permitted. Anyone who did talk with him needed to report their reasons for speaking with him, and any responses given by the old man. However, not only did Beck's orders go missing, shortly after, Dr. Beck himself disappeared. His final entry stated he was planning to confront SCP-343, after which point he seemed to disappear from the Foundation altogether. Researcher Moto reasoned that Beck had gotten too close to exposing the truth about SCP-343, and the anomalous old man had erased Beck from existence in retaliation. Showing Kaiku everything, the pair knew they couldn't confront SCP-343 or even raise his potential hostility with higher-ranking Foundation personnel, but both knew they had to do something. Researcher Kaiku started to try and conceptualize exactly what SCP-343 really was, in the hopes that knowing their enemy might give them a better chance at beating him. Moto and Kaiku reasoned that either SCP-343 was the manifestation of the concept of a godlike figure rather than actually being a god. It explained his reality-warping powers and apparent omniscience and omnipresence, but also his need to keep up the subterfuge. Or, Kaiku suggested, SCP-343 might simply be a malevolent anomalous person, a powerful reality bender who had adopted the persona of a deity as a deceptive act, designed to manipulate the Foundation. SCP-343 could have been the most powerful being in this reality. Perhaps not a literal god, but someone who thought they were, and had the power to be close enough. There was still one key question that the two researchers needed to answer. How could they keep SCP-343 contained, and do so without him realizing that's what they were doing? How does someone keep their poker face on against an opponent who can see everything, even be everywhere at once? Researcher Kaiku suddenly yelled in excitement. They'd struck an idea. SCP-343 had been given a significant level of freedom by the Foundation, more than most anomalies. So, Kaiku reasoned they should use that freedom against him. Manufacture a scenario that would make SCP-343 think he was still free, while trapping him in containment. Researcher Moto interjected, getting an idea of their own. What if they used another anomaly to keep SCP-343 contained? The two researchers, putting their heads together, came up with a proposal for an enrichment procedure, an activity that could allow SCP-343 to interact with another anomaly in the interest of making him feel valued by the Foundation. When they presented the proposal for approval, Moto and Kaiku claimed that they'd selected their candidate for the enrichment activity at random, but it had actually been a premeditated choice. SCP-173, also known as the Sculpture. Their proposal suggested the two engaged in a staring contest, the thinking behind it being that SCP-343 could look at the sculpture in perpetuity, keeping it from moving, but he'd also be unable to leave or look away himself, for risk of SCP-173 attacking. To the researcher duo's amazement, the proposal was approved, and SCP-173 was transferred to SCP-343's quarters to begin the enrichment activity. The tension hung heavy in the air as Moto and Kaiku entered SCP-343's containment chamber to find him looking unimpressed at SCP-173. Even after explaining their idea, that the old man should have a staring contest with the sculpture, he didn't seem all that enthused. What they also hadn't accounted for was that the group of personnel escorting SCP-173, all of whom had to keep their eyes fixed on the anomalous statue at all times. Kaiku rushed out of the room, telling Moto to stay put, but their hope that they'd found a way to keep SCP-343 contained was steadily dwindling. This wasn't working. Even if SCP-343 blinked, there were a dozen other people in the room looking at SCP-173. They couldn't keep SCP-343 trapped and forced to look at SCP-173 if the Foundation weren't willing to leave the two anomalies alone and unsupervised together. Suddenly, without any warning, everything went dark. Researcher Moto's heart nearly leapt out from their chest the second it happened. Someone had killed the lights. Nobody was watching SCP-173. The security personnel in the room began screaming, frantically fumbling with flashlights to cast the beams over SCP-173 and make it visible again. But the crack of their necks breaking one by one put a swift end to their attempts. Something grabbed at Moto's lab coat and pulled them to their feet, dragging them out of the containment chamber as quickly as their feet would carry them. Inside and still under the cover of dark, SCP-173 was moving freely now it couldn't be observed. And taking note of the one other still standing, the sculpture moved towards the old man, gripping him and preparing to twist the bones of his neck. Rushing out of the corridor, Moto squinted through the blood-red emergency lighting, barely able to see Kaiku pulling them along by their sleeve. Behind them, they could hear the grinding sound of heavy concrete and rebar moving of its own accord, as SCP-173 lunged at SCP-343. Kaiku explained, panting as they ran, that they'd cut the lights to the containment chamber. Almost on cue, the pair of researchers passed a corner where a fuse box was spewing sparks, a fire axe embedded in the metalwork. Clearly, researcher Kaiku had improvised. Suddenly, something burst through the nearby wall of the corridor, punching a hole in the opposite wall and narrowly missing both Moto and Kaiku. SCP-343 had just effortlessly hurled the sculpture through several feet of concrete. Kaiku grabbed their fellow researcher, stopping them from running past the parallel holes either side of the corridor, and urged them to look downwards at the floor so as not to look at SCP-173. The two of them heard the ear-splitting sound of the anomalous entity righting itself, noticing out of their peripheral vision the sight of SCP-343 walking through corridor walls as he headed towards the sculpture. Once he had passed, researcher Kaiku pulled Moto along with them as they ran, insisting that they had only let the old man look at SCP-173. Bundling into an elevator and heading down, Moto and Kaiku were breathless. The entire facility shook as SCP-343 and SCP-173 traded blows with each other. The force of unstoppable, all-powerful fists colliding with unmovable, anomalous concrete and rebar caused the very structure of Site-17 to shudder. Researcher Moto was baffled and angrily pinned Kaiku to the elevator wall. They had killed the lights, letting SCP-173 loose. While the sculpture might kill SCP-343, there was no guarantee. The plan to keep the old man contained had gone to hell, and Moto demanded to know why. Kaiku calmly explained themselves. They had realized only a moment too late the big flaw in their plan. SCP-343 was supposedly omnipresent, able to be everywhere and see everything simultaneously. What researcher Kaiku had noticed once the old man was presented with SCP-173 was that this same omnipresence had never stopped the sculpture whenever it had moved before. Whenever a mortal took their eyes off SCP-173, it could travel at impossible speeds, faster than humans could perceive. But surely, if it was still being observed by a godlike reality warper who could see everything at all times, then the sculpture would never move at all. It would always be observed. It was a paradox of omnipresence, Kaiku insisted, since SCP-343 was present everywhere and all-seeing. Even when he looked directly at SCP-173, he also technically wasn't. Just as Kaiku finished giving the explanation, another deafening clatter came from overhead, and suddenly the elevator plummeted downwards. SCP-343 and SCP-173's fight had sent one of them crashing through the elevator shaft, severing the cable and causing it to drop sharply. Moto and Kaiku were in freefall, thrown about in the air until the elevator speedily reached its destination, smashing to a halt on a lower floor of the facility. If they had been further up when the cable snapped, both researchers would have perished. Though they were badly injured, they'd only fallen a few floors and were bruised but alive. Prying the elevator doors open, Kaiku crawled out before turning to help Moto free themselves from the wrecked elevator. Above them, they heard more thunderous noises. SCP-343's fists cracked the concrete body of SCP-173. The sculpture retaliated the only way it knew how, by twisting bone, grabbing the old man, and trying to bend or break anything it could reach. It snapped an elbow, dislocating it from the joint, only for SCP-343 to phase through the sculpture, bones clicking painlessly back into place as he freed himself from its grip. By now, the entire site was on alert, sirens ringing out as other personnel scrambled to evacuate or re-establish containment as quickly as possible. But with every ground-quaking hit, cracks began forming, snaking down the walls and across the ceiling, raining powdery concrete dust onto the Foundation personnel below. Then the two anomalous beings hit each other so hard that the floor gave out beneath them, sending SCP-173 and SCP-343 tumbling down to the level below, and the level below that. Debris accumulated on each floor, falling further and further down until the ceiling above Moto and Kaiku's heads suddenly came crumbling down on top of them. It had almost been several full minutes. Moto could feel the tears streaming down their face, eyes bloodshot and stinging. SCP-173 still had its rebar fingers around SCP-343's throat. The old man was still in the sculpture's grasp, ready to drop an almighty haymaker to his opponent. The only thing stopping him was the sole observer keeping the fight paused. Except, were they? Researcher Moto, as they stood with their eyelids aching to shut for just a second, they recalled all that had happened. how Kaiku's theorized paradox of omnipresence had meant SCP-173 could move when observed by SCP-343. But there was nothing stopping the old man from moving. He didn't operate on the same rules as the sculpture did. With it now being observed, he could just phase out of its grip again. It'd be effortless for him. More desperate to blink than ever, Moto suddenly realized something. To SCP-343, this was still all part of the enrichment activity. The old man wasn't moving while the sculpture couldn't because he was just being a good sport. This was just sparring for him. He didn't need to fight SCP-173. He was doing it for fun. Eyelids twitching, thinking of their friend under the rubble, researcher Moto allowed themselves to blink. SCP-343's next strike against SCP-173 flew free, the force of the impact causing even more rubble to come raining down from the facility overhead. Keeping their eyes closed, Moto didn't see what fell from above and cracked their skull open, or what they were buried under shortly after. Now check out SCP-173 Origin Story, How 173 Got to Site-19, and SCP-343 God vs. Bill Cipher from Gravity Falls for more.